It was a crisp Monday morning in suburban Chicago when my husband Daniel dropped the news. Over breakfast, he casually mentioned that his company was sending him on a week-long business trip to New York. I tried to smile, but a pang of anxiety shot through me. Daniel and I had been married for 7 years, and we'd rarely spent more than a night apart. The thought of being alone in our spacious, modern house for an entire week felt unsettling. Daniel kissed me goodbye, his lips brushing against my forehead. "I'll call you every night, I promise," he said, his voice warm but distracted. He grabbed his suitcase, gave me one last wave, and disappeared into the Uber waiting outside. As the car pulled away, the house felt eerily quiet, the silence almost oppressive. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. I threw myself into work, catching up on projects for my freelance graphic design business. In the evenings, I binge-watched my favorite shows on Netflix and took long walks around the neighborhood, trying to shake off the loneliness. But by the third day, the emptiness of the house started to get to me. I missed Daniel's presence, the way he'd hum while making coffee in the morning, the sound of his laughter filling the rooms. That evening, I was curled up on the couch with a glass of Merlot, scrolling through Instagram when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a flicker of unease mixed with curiosity ran through me. When I opened the door, there stood Ryan, Daniel's best friend since college. He was holding a bottle of red wine and wearing that easy, confident smile of his. "Hey, Emily," he said, his voice smooth and casual. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on you. Daniel mentioned his trip, and I figured you might want some company." I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. "You didn't have to do that, but it's nice to see you," I said, trying to sound casual. Ryan and Daniel had been inseparable for years. They'd been roommates in college, best men at each other's weddings, and even started a side business together a few years back. I'd known Ryan almost as long as I'd known Daniel, but we'd never spent much time alone together. It was always the three of us, or a larger group of friends. We settled in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ryan poured us each a glass of wine, and we started talking about work, mutual friends, and how Daniel was adjusting to his new role at the company. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and before I knew it, I was laughing more than I had in weeks. Ryan had a way of making everything feel lighter. His eyes sparkled as he told stories, and his laughter was infectious. As the evening wore on, I found myself noticing little things about him. The way his shirt clung to his broad shoulders, the way his hand brushed against mine when he handed me the wine glass. There was a subtle shift in the air, a tension that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. At one point, I caught him looking at me, his gaze lingering a little too long. It wasn't inappropriate, but it felt charged, like there was something unspoken between us. I quickly looked away, my cheeks flushing. "It's just the wine," I told myself, "or the loneliness. Don't read into it." When Ryan finally left, I stood at the door, watching him walk to his car. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered, like a shadow I couldn't quite escape. The next morning, I woke up feeling unsettled. The evening with Ryan played on my mind more than it should have. I told myself it was nothing, just a result of having company after a few lonely days. But as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. I called my best friend, Sarah, hoping she could talk some sense into me. "Ryan came over last night," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Ryan? Daniel's Ryan?" Sarah asked, her voice immediately curious. "Yeah, we had some wine and talked. It was nice, but I don't know. There was this moment. I can't really explain it." Sarah was silent for a moment. "Emily, be careful. You're in a vulnerable place right now. Don't do anything you'll regret." I sighed. "I know. You're right. It's probably nothing." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Later that evening, Ryan texted me. "Had a great time last night. Hope I didn't overstay my welcome." I stared at the message, my heart racing. After a few minutes of hesitation, I replied, "Not at all. It was nice to have company." A few minutes later, another message came through. "I was thinking of stopping by again tomorrow. If you're free, of course." I hesitated, feeling a mix of anticipation and guilt swirling inside me. Part of me wanted to say no, to avoid whatever this was turning into. But another part, the part that had felt lonely and disconnected for days, was tempted. "Sure," I typed back before I could overthink it. "Tomorrow works." The next evening, Ryan arrived with takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant. We sat at the kitchen table, sharing a meal like we had countless times before. But this time, the tension between us was undeniable. Every laugh, every glance felt charged, as if we were both aware of the unspoken connection between us, but were too afraid to acknowledge it. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn to Ryan in a way that made me feel both excited and terrified. There was a familiarity between us that felt comforting but also dangerous. I caught myself wondering what it would be like if things were different, if we weren't tied to other people. Without thinking, I blurted out, "Ryan, do you ever wonder what would happen if we weren't tied to anyone else?" He looked at me, surprised but not shocked. There was a long pause before he answered, his voice quiet but firm. "I've thought about it, more than I should." My heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't expected that response, and the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. "I'm sorry," I stammered, feeling a wave of guilt wash over me. "I shouldn't have said that." Ryan shook his head. "Don't apologize. I felt it too, but I don't want to mess anything up. You and Daniel, that's sacred." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what we were both feeling. I nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over me. "Yeah," I whispered. "I love Daniel." "I know," Ryan said softly, "and I respect that. But it's hard being around you sometimes." For a long moment, we sat in silence, both of us processing the reality of what was happening. We had acknowledged something that neither of us wanted to admit, and now there was no going back. The line between friendship and something more had blurred, and we were dangerously close to crossing it. Ryan stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I should go, before we do something we can't take back." I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as he walked out the door. The house felt even emptier than before, and I was left with the complicated mess of emotions swirling inside me. When Daniel came home the next day, I hugged him tightly, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew that a part of me had shifted. Ryan and I never spoke of it again, but the unspoken connection we had shared left a mark, one that neither of us would ever forget. As I stood in the kitchen, watching Daniel unpack his suitcase, I couldn't help but wonder, what if? But I knew I had made my choice. I had chosen my marriage, but it didn't feel like a complete victory. The emotions stirred within me left a mark, one that would take time to fade. Sometimes the boundaries we think are solid can bend under the weight of unspoken feelings. But is staying on the right side of that line always enough to maintain the trust and love that a relationship is built on? What would you have done in my shoes? Would you risk crossing that line or stay firm in your commitment? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this complex situation. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.